Well, here we are on the 13th stop of the Freedom Trail. This will be the Old North Church stop. But on our way from the Paul Revere House to the Old North Church, which is pretty darn close, we're going to walk by a couple other famous spots. Just about a half a block from the Paul Revere House on Garden Court Street is where Rose Kennedy grew up. And so we can see that. And then we'll cross over to Hanover Street, which is kind of like the main street in the North End. Lots of restaurants and pastry shops and places to eat here. So, but we're going to end up in front of a church right across the street from the Paul Revere Mall, which is also known as the Prado, which is another place where we'll stop and talk. But in this church that we're going to be crossing over from is a Catholic church today. It became a Catholic church in 1860, but the church was actually built in 1804, and the architect to build that church was Charles Bulfinch. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was the one that built the new State House, the Boston, Massachusetts State House, and also the one that built the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. as the third architect in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol. Now, the church was, one of the famous members there was John Fitzpatrick, also known as Honey Fitz, who was the mayor of Boston, but he was also the father of Rose Kennedy, who was the mother of President John F. Kennedy. Rose was actually baptized in this church in 1890, and she had her funeral services in this church in 1995. She lived to be 104 years old, which is pretty amazing. So we'll cross over Hanover Street, and that puts us right at the Paul Revere Mall. The first thing you will see is an equestrian statue of Paul Revere. It was depicting his midnight ride. Now, the sculpture was Cyrus Dallin, and it was installed here in 1940. But there is one problem. The statue is facing the Catholic Church when it should be facing the opposite direction because he was riding out to the Charles River. However, it is said that the Catholic Church did not want the rear end of the horse facing it, so they turned it in this direction. But I don't know if that story is true, but it could be. Maybe they just wanted a good picture shot, because this is a very good place to take a picture in front of the statue with the steeple of the Old North in the background. Now, speaking of the steeples, the Old North is on its third steeple. The first one blew down in a storm in 1804, and then in 1954, Hurricane Carol came through and knocked it down again. So the steeple that is there today was built in 1955. However, the weather vane on top of the steeple survived both of the falls, and that weather vane was made by a man named Shem Drown. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it should be, because we talked about him while we were at Faneuil Hall. He is the one that designed the grasshopper weather vane on top of Faneuil Hall. Now, as we go inside the church, the first thing you're going to notice is the box pews, and which is very typical of colonial churches. And during that time, people would pay to have their own family boxes. And the more money you had, the closer you were to the pulpit. And some churches would allow you to decorate the box pew. In fact, the Old North was one of those churches that allowed that. Now, you have to keep in mind that the pulpit, I'll show a picture of that, the pulpit is pretty tall, high up, so he can kind of see inside those pew boxes. So I would imagine that you probably might not want to be playing on your iPhone when he's talking. But a lot of families would bring in, at the time, the churches weren't heated, so they would bring in, they call them warming boxes, and it would be like a box full of hot stones to kind of help keep them warm. Anyway, there's lots of stories that go behind the pew boxes and who owned them, but another interesting story about the Old North Church is while we're sitting in these pew boxes, because usually what we'll do is we'll go in and there'll be a docent of the church will speak to you and tell you about the midnight ride, and they'll probably tell you about the stolen angels. But before I talk about the stolen angels, I'll talk about the 1,100 dead bodies that are underneath us. So back in 1734, they started allowing crypts in underneath the church, and there's like 37 of these crypts. Each crypt would hold maybe 20 to 40 different coffins or bodies. So it got to the point where they were getting so full that they had to kind of clean out the remains that were in those crypts so they could make way for new ones, even though families had paid for this for their family. But by the 1860s, it was like outlawed. It's like, okay, no longer can you guys have crypts underneath your church. And one of the problems was that sometimes while you're in church, you might have some of that aroma coming up while you're sitting in church. So anyway, another story about, I was going to tell you about the angels. Okay, there's 4 wooden angels, beautiful angels at the back of the church on either side of the pipe organ up on the 2nd floor. Those angels are stolen. The story goes that there was French ships were on their way to Quebec with some materials and stuff for, I think it was a Catholic convent. It was either that or a church. And there was a Boston privateer by the name of Thomas Grutchy, and they seized the ship and they stole the goods. And he gifted those to the church. But one of the neat things about the angels was they were already about 100 years old when he took them. So they were created, in the 1600s, and they think it was somewhere Belgium, which at the time I guess was owned by France. But so anyway, the church has stolen property. But one of the most important events, of course, that puts Old North on the map is 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. So that is where the lanterns were hung in the steeple of the Old North Church. And the person that hung the lanterns was a man named Robert Newman. So he gained his fame for doing that. I also wanted to mention the bells of the Old North Church. They have the oldest change ringing bells in the United States. The bells were made in England in 1745. They are rung for special occasions, and even today they have it's a group by MIT, and it's called the MIT Guild of Bell Ringers, and every Sunday afternoon after the 11 o'clock church meeting, they'll ring the bells, and of course then on special occasions. Now, one of the most famous bell ringers was Paul Revere. At the age of 15, he created this contract with his buddies to take turns ringing the bells. And so the contract has a list of the rules and regulations to have membership to be one of the bell ringers. So I thought that was pretty interesting because he was quite the entrepreneur, remember? Well, that's it for the Old North Church. Of course, there's lots and lots of more stories to learn about the Old North Church, but we're going to leave it at that. I will see you at the next stop. See you at Copp's Hill. Bye.